Hello everyone, my name is Emily and I love talking about cards. Today we're doing the Modern Horizons draft review. We're going to be talking about the blue colors next. We just reviewed white, which we think is going to be a pretty workhorse color in the set. It's very likely to pair well with pretty much everything. It's got a pretty strong list of cards that are all in like the C to A range. Wouldn't say it has quite as many like bombs or ridiculous combos. It's just a really reliable, excellent color. And now we're going to be reviewing blue cards. So a quick reminder on what our general grading system is. If it is an S, that's like a bomb card that you are basically always going to snap pick. It's very likely to win the game when you play it. You would splash your colors to get it, and it's something that is just always going to like be good in your deck basically every time that you pick it. If it's an A card, that's something that is going to be good in your colors, do a lot of work for you, very likely to win the game, and is probably just going to be like a really, really strong bomb in your deck that you're very, very happy to see. A B is something where it is providing you with card advantage, providing you with card tempo, all of the things that you need for your deck, and giving you like actual advantage on the board. It's doing the things that you most want it to do. You're really happy to play it, and it's probably going to like help you win the game, but it's going to need other cards to get there as well. A C card is sort of your filler card. It's the thing that's most likely to be in your deck. I would say that most decks have like, 15 to 20 Cs. And like these are cards that will definitely like allow you to keep playing the game, getting from one place to the next, allowing you to trade with stuff 1-to-1, get your like cards out at decent rate, basically do all of the things that you want to do in Magic and continue and well, sometimes even winning the game. It's 50-50. A D card is a card that doesn't really do all that well unless it's really, really well supported by other cards, or it is a card that is just kind of bad on rate and is like kind of a slot filler. These are the draft chaff. This is the stuff where it's like something you don't really want to play, you're pretty unhappy to see. I generally define it as the card that is in your hand when you die. And finally, an F card is a card that you never want to play. It's an absolute failure case in most respects. It is a combo that you have to assemble that does not win you the game or do anything like particularly effective. It is a very poor rate card that provides you with very poor advantage. There will be some F cards in the set for sure, and pointing them out is going to be pretty important. These are going to be bottom of the pack, and it's not likely you're ever going to pick up an F. So that's sort of where we're at. All right. So first things first, let's talk about Aether Spike. I did play a blue, black, red deck at the pre-release, and I did okay with it. So we actually got to see this card. Aether Spike is a 2-cost counterspell. You get 2 energy, and then you may pay any amount of energy. You can counter the spell unless its controller pays 1 for each energy played this way. I would say that blue and red are the big energy colors, even more so than white is. Blue, red, and white are the only energy colors, but blue and red both focus on it a little bit more. Aether Spike is fairly inflexible. As a counter spell, this card generally belongs in the C zone, just because most of the time these are cards that you can play with that will deal with certain threats, but only like you basically like don't get to choose which threats you deal with, because you have to do it when you have the power up, and in Aether Spike's case you also have to have the energy up to effectively counter the spell. So most of the time this is a mana leak for 1 or 2. I actually think it's best as a mana leak for 1, because you want to play it as a 2-drop against your opponent's 2 or 3-drop, counter their spell out, and then still have an energy left over for other shenanigans. That tends to work pretty well. That being said, basically anything that's a threat enough that you're happy to Aether Spike it is going to be a nice little trade up, and you're not going to feel too unhappy about playing this card. I'd give this a C. I think it is something that can do a lot of stuff, but in the late game it starts to fall off. You can use the card even in the late game to generate energy tokens, which can be pretty helpful if you are falling behind on that particular axis. So you can either spike a spell for 0 and get 2 energy, and that's like a mild use case that kind of gives us a little bit more spark than most other mana leak effects later in the game. But I'd still rate it as C, maybe a C+ under certain circumstances, just because it does do okay on rate, and you're usually not too unhappy to play it. All right, Amphibian Downpour. 2 and a blue flash. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power and toughness 1/1. Also notably has Storm. So when you cast the spell, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies. Copies become tokens. All right. This one's a little strange. So it is a 2 and a blue removal that you can play twice on basically anything. If your opponent plays a creature, you can play Amphibian Downpour in response, and it will storm, so you'll get to take 2 of their creatures and turn them into useless 1/1s. That being said, in Eternal, these cards are always frogs. In this case, it is a 1/1 frog. Every frog is always destined to kill you. It's pretty likely that these cards will still be pretty annoying in the long run, so having Amphibian Downpour, while a pretty strong rare, is not necessarily going to give you the tempo play that you are most excited about. That being said, it does deal with 1 to 2 threats pretty quickly. It has an incredibly good blowout potential where it can just wipe your opponent's entire board off a big storm. You can still do stuff like sacrifice the frogs or destroy the enchantments to get those creatures back. So there's ways that the creatures are still threats that linger around on the board. But even without Storm, this is a pretty decent combat trick to kill an attacker and like kind of get some things going on. So I have a hard time giving this the usual like D or D plus that a frog generating creature would do. Like most of this stuff is usually like pretty bad, but this one happens to be good enough on rate with the storm effects that I'd be pretty inclined to give this a B or a B minus. I think it's a reasonable rare. It does quite a lot of work, potentially gets you a ton of card advantage. The main problem is whether or not your opponent can do cool things with the frogs to continue to kill you. And for that, you need other cards to definitely support it. It's never going to get higher than a B for sure, but wild blowout under certain circumstances, and often a 2-for-1, even though you do have to eventually trade with frogs. Next up is Bespoke Battle Wagon. So this is a 5/6 artifact vehicle. So mostly you play it as an artifact because the crew value for it is 4. You can tap to get 2 energy counters. You can tap and pay 2 energy counters to tap a creature. You can tap and pay 3 energy counters to draw a card. And you can just pay 4 energy counters to make Bespoke Battle Wagon an artifact creature until end of turn. That is a lot of different effects, so this card does have, obviously, a bit of flexibility. It can be a 5/6 vehicle, it can be a 5/6 artifact creature that isn't a vehicle and is fully uncrewed. It can tap creatures, it can draw cards, and most importantly, it's a really solid energy source. One of the better energy sources in the current set. For 4, getting 2 energy every turn feels really, really solid. This card pairs up really well with other cards that spend energy to do stuff like produce 3/3 golems. So overall, this is really not an unreasonable thing to be doing. On rate, everything it does is just a little bit awkward, so this card doesn't have a great game against most aggro decks. That being said, it still fixes a ton of different issues, even though it's kind of on turn, off turn in terms of what it is doing. It's potentially quite aggressive for its being a 5/6. It is a very, very large creature. It's a very good energy generator. The draw ability potentially gives you some value, although like that's like once every 2 turns, once every 3 turns, but like it's actually like a little bit in between. It's like once every 2.5 turns, you get a draw card off of this. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that you can play the card. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. You can also like bank some of the energy and keep it as a combat trick. Overall, I'd give this card a B. I think it's doing all the things that energy decks want to do. It's just not doing them particularly fast or well. Even so, there's just too many different angles at which this card can be played, and it's fairly hard for your opponent to keep track of all of them. So that feels like a pretty important thing. All right, Brain Surge. This is an instant, 3 cost, draw 4 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order. So the card to compare this with is like, your general divination, where it's like you pay 3, you draw 2 cards. That's a common instant that tends to be pretty good. This is a much better version of that card. It draws you 4 cards. You get to put any 2 cards, including cards you didn't draw, on top of your library in any order. That means you can order up lands, create some like interesting situations with like scry values where you can scry stuff to the bottom. It is not itself a scry, but if you can get some scry, that makes it even better. But overall, like, this is very, very strong card draw. Like, you pay 3 to get like just an absurd amount of cards. The fact that this triggers the draw 3 effects that are very common in blue, even on your opponent's turn, means that it's one of the better options for that. It's super, super efficient on rate. And yeah, overall, this looks like great card draw. Because it doesn't do anything to the board state or anything to like actually like help you out in other circumstances. Mostly what it is doing is fixing your next turn. I can't really give this higher than a B, but it's an insane amount of value and a wonderful amount of card selection, and I think it's definitely like a B, B+. I think, yeah, super strong uncommon, very worth playing. And better than basically all the other draw in the format, of which is a lot of good ones, including Deep Analysis. All right, Consigned to Memory. 1 and a blue. This is a instant. It replicates for 1, so you can do this to multiple different targets if you can pay an additional 1 for each. Counter target triggered ability or colorless spell. Okay, so this is going to be one of our first pretty low cards. It's super, super limited and probably not playable in draft. It is an instant speed counterspell for only colorless spells. There are a lot of colorless spells in the format, and paying 1 to counter a spell like that is definitely not bad on rate. I do think that that's actually pretty reasonable. But overall, like, if you are playing this in a draft pool, you're going to be facing a lot of different decks. You might not be facing decks that play devoid cards or devoid creatures, or that play these cards at the rate where Consigned to Memory is going to be particularly happy. So it can frequently incur a card disadvantage, and that's a pretty big problem. In addition, the replicate is just never happening. Like, you can counter some activated abilities potentially, but most of the time it's very unlikely that multiple abilities will be on the stack for you to counter. So you're probably not going to get like a lot of value out of that. The only reason that this would happen is if there was like a storm effect going on, and I can't think of any colorless storm cards that are like really, really worth doing a replicate to. So yeah, I think overall this card's probably not terribly playable in draft. It's a good tech card that does eat Eldrazi, but I would say it's not ever giving you a high amount of value. As a counterspell, I'm going to give this a D-. I think it's just not quite there. But I do think the amount of devoid bombs is what keeps it from being an F. I think even though this card doesn't look like it should play, the fact that some of the like really, really nasty cards in the set are in fact devoid, which is to say they don't have a color, does make this a little bit more likely to see some part of a curve. All right. Copycrook is next. Let's scoop that up. All right. Copycrook is a 4 cost. You can have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except that whenever that creature attacks, it connives. So it copies your creatures or enemy creatures, but it also adds an upside to that creature. So this is an effect that's pretty common in Magic, and it's generally not very good because what happens is you tend to suffer a bit of a tempo or advantage loss against it. When you play the card, it will almost always trade with its mirror, which means that you are playing a card kind of defensively that's not better than the card that your opponent is playing. And typically in a Magic game, you want to be playing a little bit of one-upsmanship. You want to be continuing to advance the tempo. You want to be removing their creature while playing your own creature. You want to be basically like continuing to push the board state as opposed to even out the board state. When you even out the board state, stuff can happen, like your opponent can play some stuff onto the creature that they have, and then their creature is better than yours. And that gets into like some pretty big difficulties. But the connive ability does give this card the ability to get over its mirror image, which kind of makes it okay in that respect. I would say that if you pair this with hard removal, you can get some pretty wild blowouts. You can definitely demoralize your opponents in some way. We're going to be playing this card in Arena, of course, and we are reviewing this for Arena. I will say that cards that do kind of like weird demoralizing effects to your opponent in Arena can often lead to hard concedes, which helps them out a little bit. That being said, this card is a C-. It is not really very playable. It kind of fits the 4 slot, and you're okay with that. Copying your own creatures can be okay, but this never gets to be that big of an effect, and the connive is not big enough to make it good. So yeah, overall, not that strong of a card. Corrupted Shapeshifter, a devoid card. It's a 4-cost devoid that enters the battlefield as your choice of a 3/3 creature with flying, a 2/5 creature with vigilance, or a 0/12 creature with defender. So flexible creatures are nice, especially when they have like a decent rate on them. A 4-cost 3/3 flyer for 4, pretty adequate creature. That's the base state. You're going to be pretty happy with that. A 2/5 vigilance for 4 is underwhelming, but it can fit an aggro board state in some pretty good ways. You're not going to be too unhappy to see this card. 5 health is enough to beat a lot of the red removal, so if you're in an aggro position, you can play this card as a 2/5, and then, hey, that doesn't feel too bad. You're actually in a much better situation as a result of playing it. So, reasonable creature on 4 for that, but definitely not like a high value creature. Finally, the 0/12, hilariously large. Blocking, even with a 0/12, is not actually all that good. Most of the time, your opponent's going to have hard removal for it or be able to get around it, so not a huge deal. You could potentially find a weird combo with this, but I've reviewed all the cards and I don't think there's a great one, so I think the 0/12 is not going to see a lot of play in the format. I would give this card a C. I think it is a really flexible creature, and flexibility is important, and I think the 3/3 flyer for 4 is a solid enough card on rate that you're playing that 80% of the time, and still being pretty happy with it. So, yeah. All right, Demon Inferior. 3 and a blue for a card that costs 1 less to cast for each card you've drawn this turn. It is a sorcery, and the owner of target non-land permanent puts it into the library second from the top or on the bottom. So yeah, this is kind of interesting. I kind of wish it did second from the bottom. I don't know why. I just think it would be funny. Yeah, anyways, so yeah, this card is always actually a 3-drop, because if you're playing it on your turn, it's a sorcery. That means you drew a card, which means you are playing it for 3. Oftentimes you're going to be playing this for 1, because there are cards in the set like Brainstorm, Deep Analysis. There are cards that draw you an additional card for 1. So I would say this card is pretty frequently going to be played for less than its normal cost, and its normal cost is 3, which is not unreasonable. As a removal card, this is decently strong. It removes all types of permanents, including artifacts that are quite a problem for you. It is probably going to fit like whatever it is that it wants to hit. It can get rid of things without putting them in the graveyard, which messes with bestow creatures. The main thing about it is that second from the top means that they do see the card again eventually. So if it was something with a strong summon effect or something that was absolutely going to blow you out, this doesn't get rid of the problem for good, and it can create more problems for you in the future, which gives it a little bit of limited flexibility. I'm going to give this card a B-. I think it might be in the C+ range under some circumstances, just because like if the meta is like particularly strong on summon effects, this card almost never gets its value. But overall, this is like a very, very good thing to be doing to your opponents, and blue has this kind of interesting like weird aggro thing going on where they can be aggressive but still draw a bunch of cards and play Consigned to Memory, and that's kind of the thing that this supports. It's like an aggressive draw strategy. So I like it. I think it's proactive and interesting, and I think overall I think it belongs in the B category just barely. All right. Deep Analysis. This is an oldie but a goodie. It is a 4-cost sorcery that gives you 2 cards and then flashbacks again for 2 more cards at the cost of 3 life. Very, very simple. Isn't a fast spell, so you can't really play it at instant speed. You can't play it in response to things. You have to tap out to play it, which means you are vulnerable in the early game, in particular when playing Deep Analysis, which is not ideal. So yeah, this card has always been very good for value. It is a 4/4/1 card, effectively, so you get 3 cards worth of advantage out of it. You have to pay 5. You have to pay 6 mana and 5 life for that over the course of 2 turns, but the second turn is a turn you're pretty happy about because you are pulling a bunch of removal into your hand and you definitely have the power to cast it. So overall, this is reasonable. It's fairly hard to play against aggressive decks. I would give this a B-. I think the format can potentially punish you for doing this kind of stuff, but overall, this is definitely not an unreasonably bad card, and it works with discard effects like the Depth Defiler, which we are going to be talking about next. So yeah, this is pretty good to play with. You're never going to be unhappy about it. It's not like your opponent can make you discard it or counter it because the flashback ability always gets you value regardless. So this is just going to get you there in terms of the control deck. That's feeling pretty good. All right, Depth Defiler. This is a 3 blue blue for a Eldrazi 3/5. It's devoid, so it has no color. You can also pay an additional 1 colorless mana only to cast a spell. When you cast a spell, you choose 1, and if it was kicked, you choose both. Return target creature to its owner's hand, or target player draws 2 cards and then discards a card. So 3 blue blue, draw 2 cards, discard a card for a 3/5. 5 mana for a mid-rate creature, but then you kind of fix and look for other stuff. That's playable, but not amazing. Once you're into the 5-drops, you're starting to look for things that you can really like start to push with. You're starting to worry about 7-drops and 6-drops that are actually pretty bonkers and out of control. So like you want to be playing something that's actually going to toe-to-toe with those a little bit, and drawing and discarding is pretty terrible rate. This triggers 3 draw 3 effects, which means you can use it to trigger all of your different like effects that care about drawing 3 cards in a turn. And it can also discard Deep Analysis and other stuff like that. But I would say overall, this card is like a C-. It is an okay body that fits the curve and does a couple of other things that are somewhat useful, but none of the things that it's doing are great on rate. So it's probably not going to be better than a C. Yeah, okay. Dreamtide Whale, 2 and a blue for a Vanishing 2/7/5. This has Vanishing 2, and whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, you proliferate. Proliferate is not as common in this set as I would like it to be for this card to be good, but I do think that this card is nonetheless reasonable. It is a 7/5, which is just an absolutely horrendous beat. The problem is that the format has a lot of Eldrazi spawn tokens and other things like that that can effectively block it, and it is -1 card value for you if it somehow doesn't get removed, which I honestly think that if somebody plays this card, it is a good removal target because the amount of damage that it does if it gets through even once is pretty worth noting. So yeah, this card has to be played pretty aggressively, but I do think that it's got such a ridiculous like amount of options available to it in terms of both like persisting as a way to like block and deal with larger like cards, and also just attacking for consistent damage, consistently getting very good trades. I would say this card is almost always going to trade pretty effectively for what it is, and 3 is such a cheap cost for a 7/5. Like, just getting that amount of damage across that early is going to lead to some very strong aggro decks, and the card doesn't feel too bad in control, because I think it is going to 1-for-1 much more often than it's 0-for-1s. So yeah, I'm going to give this a B. I think I have it at an A- at the moment, but with the amount of like Eldrazi spawn, I have to lower it quite a bit. So it's a B, B-. But yeah, it's definitely a very strong card. Seems great for what it's doing, and nothing wrong with that. All right, Electrozoa. Okay, this is a 3/1 with Flash and Flying. When it enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you tap this creature unless you pay an energy. So this is kind of a combat trick, because you can play it in response to an opponent attacking and then block, and then you get a little bit of extra energy on top of that. That being said, it's a pretty limited combat trick. It only deals 3 damage. And you can't use this to push for lethal, even though it's a flying creature, because it's just very, very hard to keep this thing alive for any amount of time. I would say that overall, this is like just it's brutal on your energy reserves. You have to play it in aggressive decks that also provide a lot of energy, and chances are you're going to want that energy for other stuff too, so having to pay it just to keep your fairly low rate flyer alive, especially when that card can be removed by a number of other threats, means this card doesn't ever get better than a C. I think it is just like a little bit too weak. I'm going to give it even a C-. I think the Flash... No, the Flash does bump it up, because you can use it to be like in a removal area. So I give this a C. I think it is good as a removal card on rate, but getting into the late game, this card becomes very, very dead, and that is a bit of a problem. So, all right, Emrakul's Messenger. 1 blue for a 2-cost 2/1 flyer. Already not bad. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature to add a colorless mana. Colorless mana fixing is always nice. You're never too unhappy to see that, and drawing second card each turn is even easier than drawing third card each turn, which is a thing that a lot of other cards in this format care about. Overall, this is not too terrible. It's a pretty aggressive flyer. It has Devoid, which is not a big deal, but definitely doesn't hurt. And it is just also capable of occasionally creating a little bit of upside. A 2/1 for 2 with upside certainly doesn't feel bad. I would give this a B+. I think it's a great card for its slot, and the amount of things it's doing, including creating blockers on the ground, which is something that most flyers really need to do. Tying up the ground is just really helpful because if you're playing evasive flyers, they're not trading with your opponent. So if you can do stuff like create extra tokens to block like big creatures, then they're going to get there in a pretty good way. So yeah, I'll give this a B+. Estrid's Invocation. There's 2 and a blue for an enchantment, and it enters the battlefield as a copy of an enchantment you control, except that the enchantment Estrid's Invocation has at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile this enchantment. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Okay, a lot of things going on here. You need another enchantment to cast this. It has to be something that's good enough that you're happy having 2 copies of it. And it's fairly hard to do this in draft. Overall, like if you're trying to assemble 2 enchantments, that's pretty difficult. You still have to like sort of get everything together, and if you can get the setup together, it's potentially pretty powerful. There are some very good enchantments in the format, and you don't feel too bad copying it. The thing that almost saves this is that it can have that ability to exile itself and return to the battlefield under its control. That changes the state of the card as far as I know. So it exiles and then it comes back, but it should come back as an Estrid's Invocation, which means it can change the target of the enchantment that it's going after. So you can use it to copy a cheap aura early on, and then later on when you play your big bomb, this card can turn into that at the end at the next upkeep. That's a pretty big deal. Overall, though, this is like a D+. I think it's just a little bit too hard to assemble. What it is doing is too limited in scope, and it requires you to play good enchantments, which means that it's really, really hyper-specific. This is not going to get much better than that. All right. Flare of Denial. 1 blue, it's a counterspell. You can sacrifice a non-token blue creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost. So it's a counterspell, but it's potentially free. This can get you negative value because you have to sacrifice a creature to counter a spell, but the fact that you can always answer their biggest bomb no matter what, as long as you have this card in your hand, means that I would potentially put it at a B. Most cancel cards are not going to make it higher than a C, but this one just basically says that, like, if your opponent plays Emrakul in a absolute surprise sweep, you can still counterspell it. You're going to feel pretty happy about it, assuming Emrakul can be countered. So, like, yeah, any big drop that is absolutely going to be the thing that kills you, the cost is a creature and a card out of your hand. That's negative advantage, but the amount of selection this card gives you, I would say, is very, very strong, and just paying 3 for it to counter out a regular card is never, like, a bad thing. You're not terribly unhappy to have this in your hand. So the ability to save you from a lot of different effects at any particular time, and the ability to surprise your opponent at a time when they assume that you are completely incapable of targeting their best creature, means that Flare of Denial gets a little bit higher rate than most counterspells in the format, and basically all cancels. So yeah, it's a B. All right, next up, Harbinger of the Seas. This is a 1 blue 2/2 that says non-basic lands are islands. It's not a bear, which is notable and important. So there's some interesting things going on here. I would say that a 2/2 for 3 is pretty bad on rate, and that's probably going to get it a D. One of the things that you need to note about this card, I might give it a D+ specifically because of this, is that non-basic lands in this format are pretty good and pretty common. There's a cycle of common basic lands that have cycling, which of course your opponent can cycle if they see them, but they provide colorless mana, which is really, really important. Harbinger's Disease completely cuts off your opponent's access to colorless mana through lands. And they can also like turn into other lands, so people are pretty likely to play them. In addition, there are the non-basic lands that are pretty. There's a set of non-basic lands that are pretty common because they are also creatures. So if people are playing those cards for mana fixing specifically, and you play a Harbinger of the Seas, that screws with them in a pretty real way. That being said, screwing with specific kinds of decks is never a thing that you are looking to do in Limited, because the other kinds of decks that you aren't screwing with are just going to laugh you off and continue charging at your face. And that is usually going to lead to game losses alongside your game wins. So while having that extra power against the very weird decks is quite good, having the reduced power against other decks gives you the kind of unreliability that makes it very hard to establish a 7-win game, and that's why this card doesn't get higher than a D+. So it's interesting. It is actually quite good in a lot of circumstances. I think I only played 10 basic lands in my pre-release deck because I had so many good like non-creature cards that played other stuff, and I had the ability to seek out lands with other stuff. And yeah, I think I had 4 of those common lands. So yeah, potentially very interesting, but I would say that most people aren't going to be picking non-basic lands nearly as highly in draft. And overall, this is just this is a pretty high hope to have. Okay, Hopeender Coatl. This is an Eldrazi snake with Devoid Flash. When you cast a spell, counter target spell an opponent controls unless they pay 1. So it is a 2/2 with Flash, and then you also get to mana leak them when you do it. And it's Devoid, which is not hugely important, kind of awkward really, but hey, there you go. An interesting combat trick and a mid-rate creature. 3/4, a 2/2, definitely not bad. The evasion helps, and if you get some actual value out of this is a 2-for-1 and a tempo buff because you play a creature and you counter out your opponent's next creature, which means that if you're playing pretty aggressively, this is something that kind of goes pretty nuts. I would say overall, this is a reasonable B+ creature. Does good things. It's not always going to do the best, and it gets worse the later into the format that you get, but you're pretty happy to play this on 3 most times, and if you're holding up 3 mana, your opponent might actually have to play around this, which is fun to see. Okay. Hydroelectric Specimen. This is a land, so you can pay 3 life to have it not enter the battlefield tapped, otherwise it does. But if you decide not to play it as a land, it's a 2 and a blue for a 1/4. When it enters the battlefield, you can change the target of target instant or sorcery spell with a single target to Hydroelectric Specimen. So close to being exciting. So yeah, this can counter out spells that deal damage to creatures, but most often that's by having it target your specimen instead. So I think it has to be a legal target. I don't think you can do like something that targets players only or planeswalkers only, but that's not typically too huge of a deal. It would be nice if this was like an artifact weird, or like an enchantment artifact or an enchantment creature. Something along those lines might give it a little bit more flexibility, but yeah, overall, what this is doing is allowing you to potentially counter out a card, but at the cost of the Hydroelectric Specimen. And as a 1/4 creature, bad on rate. Not doing a lot of interesting stuff there. Overall, I'd say this card does not really provide any mode that you're excited about, so I'd put it at a D. I just don't think a non-basic land is going to be like the most important. Yeah, I just don't think it's like your best possible option. Can it actually go to a D? That's actually an interesting question. It's the worst of the land options by a pretty large margin, but I think I actually have to give it a C because it's a land, and a land that also plays as a creature is very valuable. Yeah, I think it's a C minus. It's a land. You get to play it, so I'm actually changing my mind on that one. Hydroelectric is weird and lovely, and I forgot that I was reviewing lands in a different spot, but that's okay. It's still good. It's fine. It's a C minus. Okay, Kappa Cannoneer. So Yeah, this is a 6-cost 4/4 with Improvise. Your artifacts can help cast the spell. Each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pay for 1. So you have to tap the artifacts, so it's not quite affinity, but it's pretty close. It's a 4/4 with Ward 4. Ward 4 is very good, actually. I would say that most creatures don't have a ward that high, and that amount of ward makes it actually legitimately very tough to kill this creature. When Kappa Cannoneer or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer, and it can't be blocked this turn. So it starts out as a 5/5 for 6, and then it becomes a 6/6 for 6 and is unblockable, and then it becomes a 7/7, and probably by that point your opponent is dead. Yeah, it's definitely okay for blue. I wouldn't say it's amazing, but the fact that you can potentially get there with just a couple of artifacts really gives it a lot of potential advantage, and it is fairly hard to kill. I would say that blue is not playing as many artifacts as you would expect, so I would say this is fine. I'm going to give it a B minus. I think it is very likely to win the game for you under most circumstances, but you do need the artifacts to get there, and it can still be removed. A 4/4 is not, a 5/5 is not ridiculously big for what it's doing. It's a good affinity creature. It definitely works pretty well, but I just don't think it's quite exactly what you need. Even so, you're never going to be too unhappy to play this card in your deck. All right, Kozilek's Unsealing. 2 and a blue. Devoid. Whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4, 5, or 6, create 2/0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature to add a colorless. When you cast a creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, you draw 3 cards. So, this is a pretty interesting enchantment. 3-cost enchantments are typically pretty tricky. They have to do very good things because the tempo loss from skipping your turn 3 is frequently quite relevant and absolutely lethal against the most hyper aggro decks in the game. That being said, your 4, 5, and 6 drops all generate 2 blockers, which are going to help quite a bit against that type of situation. Those blockers also ramp you into your 7s, which means you can play this into a 4-drop, into a 7-drop, which is kind of wild for a blue deck, to be sure. And finally, when you play your 7-drop, you just fully refresh your hand, which yeah, that's very, very nasty. So this is providing a lot of interesting and wild value for the deck. I still think I give it a C+. I think it is, the mid-tempo is quite a lot. It's asking quite a lot from you. It's asking for you to play a very expensive deck, which is potentially a way that you can lose the game just by building around this card. But the amount of value it provides is good enough that if you do build around it, it's going to be pretty strong. And that's a place that a C+ is generally pretty happy to say. Like, it's not something that you're going to pick every time, but it is something that if you pick it and you build around it, you might end up with something you're happy with. All right, Petrifying Middler. Okay, so this is a 5-drop 4/5 Devoid. When you cast a spell, you tap up to 1 target creature, and you put a stun counter on it. That's an effect that is generally pretty okay. Stunning a creature while also playing a creature means you get at least 1 attack in with this. If it's just like trading in the late game, tends to be pretty decent in the general like setup where you are trying to stop aggro, because you can be like, oh yeah, this creature here can't attack, and I've got this body here that's probably going to deal with any other creature that you've got. So very good for stalling out the game. Potentially okay for getting in for that extra couple of attacks that you need to win the game. Both of those modes feel pretty okay. I would say this isn't terribly aggressive. You're rarely happy to play this 5-drop like that often. The reach is really helpful, but I'd still only give this a C. I think it's just doing everything it should, but not much more than that. All right, Reefworm. This is a sacrifice card. It is a 3 and a blue 0/1. So we're not off to a great start. When it dies, you create a 3/3 blue fish creature. With when this creature dies, you create a 6/6 blue whale creature. With when this creature dies, create a 9/9 blue kraken creature token. There's always a bigger fish. So yeah, this is a sacrifice combo card in blue-black. Blue-black does not have a lot of sacrifice synergy in general. I would say this card is a C- to a D+. 4 is a tremendous amount for a 0/1. If you pay for this and manage to sacrifice it even in like the first turn, it's 4 mana for a 3/3, which is still not very good. The fact that it can chump block is nice, but there are a lot of ways to potentially get around that. White can remove it pretty easily without having to deal with it. Blue can remove it pretty easily without having to deal with it. Red probably doesn't care about it mostly. Like they maybe charge into the 0/1 and then kill the 3/3 and just kind of like keep working around it that way. I guess it is eventually going to be like a bit of a problem for red, but it takes a little while to get there, so they've got the potential to kill you there. It's much easier to kill tokens than it is to kill dudes. There's a lot of ways to exile the creature. If you're trying to sacrifice it, I would say that most of the edict effects in this set are actually pretty terrible, so that's a bit of a problem. But yeah, all of that is to say, like, this is just kind of okay. Overall, it's a C minus. I would say it is gonna potentially work in a couple of decks, but most of the time when you're playing this, you're actually going to be a little unhappy, and you might lose from your opponent playing around it pretty well. So, yeah. All right. Royal Cartographer. I missed that this card... This is such a good pun that I literally missed that this card said royal instead of royal with a Y. I actually typed it into my spreadsheet with a Y. Okay, so yeah, 1 and a blue for a 1/3. Landfall, whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get an energy counter. You can pay 6 energy counters to draw 3 cards. 6 energy counters is pretty hard to amass, and by the time you have that amount of energy cards, you may not want 3 cards. You may want to kill your opponent. There are a lot of potential better ways to use this energy, but I would say that energy in general is not spent especially efficiently, and 3 energy counters for 2 energy counters per a card is a pretty good rate. So if you're playing this card entirely for value, yeah, you're not feeling too unhappy about it. It is a pretty consistent energy generator. Landfall means that you're going to be seeing, at least 4 to 5 of these energy tokens as long as this creature lives, which means that your opponent is probably going to want to kill this thing. And that is something that you want every 2-drop to do. It blocks a lot of good aggro deck stuff. It is not always likely to trade, but it is pretty likely to at least eat a card. And if it lives, I think generally like the amount of energy it's providing is worth it. So yeah, I'd give this card a B-. I think it's fine. I think it is doing everything you want it to do at 2. It is kind of specific to the energy deck, but it is also pretty capable of playing on its own and potentially even just doing the thing that is absolutely insane on its own. So yeah, drawing 3 cards is lovely. It's a lovely dream to have, and as a 2-drop, you're not feeling too bad about this. There's so many energy cards in this set. All right, Sage of the Unknowable. 2 cost for a 0/4. You can tap to add a colorless. You can spend this mana only to cast a colorless spell, or to activate an ability. Alright, a 0/4 doesn't trade or fight. It only ramps for Eldrazi and fixes for Eldrazi. There's a lot of lands that already provide colorless mana, and I would say that there are many other cards that are pretty good in this slot that you would be more happy to play. I would say this is a C-. You aren't always unhappy to play a 2-drop creature, but this is one of the most unhappy 2-drop creatures you're going to play. Serum Visionary. Ooh, this card's lovely. 3 for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and then you scry 2. Okay, so 2/2 with a free card. You get the free card before you scry, so you don't get to see what that card is, but even so, the card has already replaced itself on advantage. That's already like B territory. Like this kind of rate at 3, you feel great about that. The scry gives you even further selection. I'm going to bump that up to a B+. This is pretty bad tempo, but you're probably not ever unhappy playing this card. It trades with all of the aggro cards. It is pretty likely to trigger a bunch of other stuff that you care about, and it can even help you get into those like draw 3 archetypes, as well as to those draw 2 archetypes. So yeah, sick card, B+. Great option to be playing, and one of the premier like commons for blue. Just lovely, lovely thing. You can play as many of those as you like. Shadow of the Second Sun, 6 cost enchant player. Beginning of enchanted player's post-combat main phase. There's an additional beginning phase after this phase. All right, this is a weird one because you got to read it a little bit because you hear the word phase and you're like, okay, so you get another untap? No, what actually happens is you get an untap step, an upkeep step, a draw step, and then your second main phase happens. I got this card in my pre-release, and I was very happy with it. I already had it at an A. It's gonna stay there. All right, so a couple things about this. One, all of your creatures have vigilance. After they attack, they all untap. That's pretty good. Two, you get a card draw every turn. After they untap, you get your upkeep step, so you get to draw a card. Three, you get all of your mana back in your second main phase, which means you can play insane tempo. This card is going to spiral you out of control. It is one of the contenders for that S rank. This is an A plus. I think it is great. Four colorless makes this surprisingly easy to cast early because you can just ramp to it with like a bunch of like other stuff that actually gives you colorless bonuses. Once you play this card, you are just gonna have like you're going to be playing twice as many cards as your opponent. You aren't going to be doing twice as many attacks and twice as many other things, but for 6, this is one of the best options that you can play really early on to just make a control deck work. And I would say that even in like an aggressive option, this feels really, really good. It helps out with that draw 3 archetype again. It allows you to like play cards like Serum Visionary into a draw 3 effect. It is very, very strong on card value. It is going to spiral the game out of control. And most importantly, you don't lose tempo when you play it because you pay all of the mana for it in your first main phase, and then you get a second main phase where you can play another 6-drop free of charge. Really, really good stuff. This card's great. A plus to S. Beautiful, beautiful card. All right, Shrieking Drake. I have lost with it in play though, so I don't think it quite makes S. All right, Shrieking Drake is a 1/1. For 1 blue. I think this card has existed forever, as probably evidenced by the art, but also from the fact that I recognize the art. Okay, 1/1 flying. When it enters the battlefield, you return a creature you control to its owner's hand. This is pretty minimal. 1/1 flyer's fine. The fact is that you have to return the creature you control to its owner's hand, so you can't just play this on turn 1. You have to wait. Overall, I'd say this is a much worse Nurturing Pixie. I'm very skeptical of this card, and I think it's a D. But combo potential is possible. Sing It to Stupor. All right, it's a land. Which land is it? It's the pay 3 life or it enters the battlefield tapped. We'll review this in the land set. I'm going to remember this time. We'll talk about this in the land one. We're going to talk about all the land ones in the land ones, even the ones I already reviewed. So go check that one out. It'll be up in... I'm planning to release these, I think, every 12 hours, and that should get us to like the 11th. So it'll be up by the time that the thing comes out. All right, Strict Serenade. All right, Strict Serenade is 1 blue to counter target artifact creature or planeswalker spell. Its controller creates a 2/2 blue bird creature token with flying. So it's a counter spell, except your opponent kills you with a bird. This is an F. You never want to give your opponent a 2/2 bird. A 2/2 bird in a card advantage battle, which is what blue is often trying to do, means that you have another problem to deal with, and the only thing that you did was prevent your opponent from playing a problem. You lose tempo when you play this. It's just not great. Giving your opponent his bird is very bad. There are 2 blue cards that give your opponent a bird in this format, and both of them are really potentially quite awful. I am going to be a little bit nicer to the other one, just as a note. But yeah, I don't think this card's as strong. All right, Tameo meets a story circle. This is... Oh, wait. We should talk about Tameo first. Where's Tameo? Oh, I guess she's second alphabetical. H-I-J-K-L-M-N. All right. Well, I have it in alphabetical order, but that's fine. Tameo meets a story circle. 2... 1 and a blue, so for a saga, the saga does 3 things. First, on your first turn, until your next turn, whenever a creature attacks you, it gets -2, -0 until end of turn. There's a bad effect. All it does is stall the board. On your second turn, you discard any number of cards, then you investigate twice for each card discarded this way, which means you create 2 clues, and you can pay 2 to draw more cards. So you can get rid of some of your bad cards, and then you'll get more good cards as a result of that, or you can get rid of some of your good cards, and then you'll get more good cards maybe as a result of that. This is technically value, but it's not great. I would not say that that is a particularly strong card advantage engine. The only thing it's kind of doing is triggering those draw 3 effects. Third, on your third turn, you shuffle up to 3 target cards from your graveyard into your library. That's kind of interesting if your opponent's trying to mill you out, but nobody's trying to mill you out in this format. I don't think it really happens. There are a couple of cards that might mill you out that are yours if you're in green or something like that, but Bad Effect 1, Bad Effect 2, Bad Effect 3, this is an F. I do not like this card. You can get card advantage from this if you pay like 600 million mana, but that's a lot to lose. It's very likely to get you into a bad situation. This is a pretty terrible design because it stalls out the board and it's just about like drawing a bunch of cards. It's keeps you from dying a little bit because you can like copy it with like Estrid's Invocation. So if you're getting milled, then it like can make your draft games last 50 minutes by like playing a bunch of these. So if you're trying to like force a draw, yeah, no, it's it's bad. This is not a good card. This is one of the worst cards for blue. All right, Tameo, Inquisitive Student. 1 blue. This is a 0/3 creature, and it's one of those flippy planeswalkers, so let's get into it. At base, it's a 0/3 that whenever attacks investigate, which will get you clues. That's okay. 3 health flyer for 1. That feels pretty good. The fact that it's not doing damage, but is instead getting you card advantage with every attack, actually feels fine. That still feels like a really, really good rate card for 1. It allows you to even like attack into a card draw on 2 if you don't have anything else to do, which means you can fix for your lands if you got a 2-land hand. Or even if you got a, well, not even if you got a 1-land hand, because you do have to pay 2 for the clue. So yeah, you've got some real potential to get consistency out of that card, which is excellent. When you draw your 3rd card in a turn, exile Tameo, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. Notably, not a May, unlike a Johnny. That's an important thing to note because it is different for each of the flip planeswalkers. It might be mostly not a May, but yeah, that is still something that you have to care about. Okay, so you get a decent amount of card draw engine off of this until you get too much card draw, and then Tameo flips. Overall, right away, the card is pretty good. Like, if you're just looking at this as a creature, which I really like to do with these planeswalkers, I think it's pretty decent. You don't feel bad about this as a 1-drop, and you're going to be pretty happy with it until it flips. And then once it flips, you're going to be a little unhappy. You might even be a little unhappy that it did flip, because maybe you didn't want to transform her. She's a constant card advantage engine. All right, that being said, let's transform her. Tameo Seasoned Scholar is a 2 loyalty card, +2 until your next turn. When a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -1 to -0 until end of turn. That's pretty mid. -1, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. If it's a green card, you get a mana of any color. Oh, that's a -3, right? So you can't play that one until you've done the bad effect at least once. The bad effect does protect your planeswalker, but not from like most types of removal or like damage, and not from like bigger creatures, which your opponent will probably have by the time Tameo flips. So, yeah, the -3 is a card advantage, but it's not the same type of card advantage that the creature was getting. -7, draw cards equal to the half the number of cards in your library rounded up. You get an emblem with you have no maximum hand size. That is a stupid amount of cards, and probably wins you the game, but you're never playing that. That's not going to happen in draft. If it does happen in draft, enjoy your 40 card hand. I'm sure it's going to be very annoying. This is the card I least want to flip in the format. That being said, the creature alone is an A-, so what's not to love? The answer is this. This is what's not to love. Okay. So, next up, we have Tempest Harvester. 1 in a blue for a 2/1. All right, already going okay on rate. It's not like there's a lot of like burn for 1 options. There are a couple that care about this type of thing, but I wouldn't say that there's that much of it in the format. There's a black card in particular that gives -1s, but it's like a 4-drop, so this is still pretty aggressive. Okay, when it enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy. Great. 2/1 with upside. Always lovely to see. There's a lot of cards like this that are just fine bears on rate. I think the reason that energy is going to be a good thing in this format is because all of the 2/1s for 2 that give energy are pretty reasonable. Pay an energy, draw a card, discard a card. Okay, so you get the looter ability, but you have to pay energy for it. The looter ability is traditionally pretty strong. Paying energy for it is not amazing. I would say a lot of these 2-drops, you often don't want to use the energy that they give you for the thing that you most want them to, and so you can't really evaluate that quite as much on the card. That being said, draw a card, discard a card can get you out of some sticky situations. So this card has a little bit of value late because you can play it, and then you can start digging to try and get out of your lands, which is pretty nice if you're flooded out. Overall, this is fine. I would say that this is a pretty strong C, a C+. So, yeah. All right. Triton Wave Breaker. 1 blue for a 1/1. This has bestow 1 and a blue, so you can play it as an aura, and then it'll turn back into a creature if the creature that you enchanted is set up. It's a 1/1. If it's a creature, it has prowess, and if it is an enchantment, the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has prowess. Both of those things are fine. This is one of the weaker versions of the aura, but if you're playing a big aura deck, then auras are non-creature spells, so prowess will continue to be kind of relevant. This leads to some interesting tricks and some other interesting stuff. I've never rated prowess particularly highly because you have to invest a lot into it, so I wouldn't give this higher than like a D+. I think it's pretty mid for a 1-drop, and most of the time you don't need to play a 1-drop quite that badly. And as an enchantment, it is a little bit stronger, the fact that you can get that ability twice, but I think I don't want to be lured in too much by bestow, because auras are still not amazing, and this is nowhere near the amount of value provided by the white version of this card. Yeah, D+ is where it stays. Two to the narrative. 1 blue, get 2 energy, and draw a card. This is a really, really strong effect. I think I had this at a C, and that was obviously wrong now. It's a B. Hyper-specific to energy decks, but it nonetheless makes your deck smaller. It helps with your card draw, your 2 spells or 3 spells a turn. You're never particularly unhappy to fill your deck with it, so yeah, it's a B, B-. It's not an unreasonable thing to be playing on 1. The 2 energy it's one of the most helpful ways to get 2 energy in the format, because you can do it without investing too deeply into other types of energy. Like, you will just get this and like a bear, and then you'll have enough energy to pay for one of your major big effects, and that's a pretty big deal. And if you have like 12 of these, yeah, sure, your energy deck gets pretty out of control. So not unreasonable. There's not a lot of mill in the format, so making your deck smaller is just all upside. This is solid B. All right, Ugin's Binding. Oh, I didn't know this card was in the draft pack, so I don't think oh, no, I do have it. Never mind. Once again, I've got some cards twisted around here. All right, Ugin's Binding. 2 and a blue. Devoid. Return not target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. So you get to bounce for 3. Whenever you cast a colorless spell with mana value 7 or greater, you can exile Ugin's Binding from the graveyard. When you do, return each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. All right, this is pretty solid. The bounce effect is not amazing. It's fine, but it is nonetheless an option to win the game later. If you are playing just like a standard like blue-green like sort of nonsense option, and you're just like going into your 4/4, your 5/5, your 6/6, you play your 7-cost ridiculous monster, and your opponent is already maybe struggling a little bit against your tempo because you played the Ugin's Binding, so they're a little bit behind already. Suddenly they have all of their stuff bounced. They lose all of their tempo, and you get to attack them, which is just gross. It's a very, very solid way to kill your opponent, and the instant effect is at least impactful enough to justify sort of getting into these other 7s. And there's a lot of 7s in the format. So yeah, I'd say this card can, even on the defensive, buy you a lot of time, kill a lot of tokens, get a lot of value, and overall, you're never going to be too unhappy to play this. So that makes it a B. Unfathomable Truce. It's 5 for draw 3 cards, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sack this creature, add a colorless. I wouldn't give this much higher than a C+, because it's pretty worse than the other card draw options due to the amount of tempo loss that you're incurring. It's still pretty good if you're late. The card advantage is pretty solid. It's somewhat comparable to deep analysis in terms of the amount of like general value that you're getting, and it kind of fogs the board on top of drawing a bunch of cards because it gives you a couple of creatures to kind of block with, or a creature to block with. So it's It's fine. Overall, I would say this card is definitely not bad, but it's so heavy for a card draw only card, and it's just a little bit too inconsistent. So yeah, I think it's like a C plus. The card advantage is too high not to ignore, but this is very, very specific. So utter insignificance. Not the removal you want, but it is removal that you might get. One in a blue for an enchanted creature that lose all abilities and has base power and toughness 1/1. So blue can just do this stuff to you all the time. The storm one is much better, but at common this is maybe not too unreasonable, and you can pay 2 and a colorless only mana to exile enchanted creature, so the frog is no longer destined to kill you because it never existed in the first place. Yeah, I think this is like pretty mid. You probably don't want to be playing this very often, but at least you can do it to some stuff as a combat trick and then block the creature to remove it from the game completely. And even if you don't manage to do that and your opponent cannot like equip the 1/1 and make it very, very nasty because they know you'll have the option to eventually exile it later. So it's slow, it's not good on rate, it's not good on value, but it is playable as a C minus. So there you go. All right. Oh no, is this the last card? Are we reviewing? This is the last one? Yes, it is. It's Volatile Storm Dragon. I. I'm barely gonna be able to justify this one. I'm sorry. So I currently have this card in my spreadsheet as a B minus. So it's a 3/2 flyer with semi-hexproof. Hexproof from activated and triggered abilities. When it enters the battlefield, you exchange control of Volatile Storm Drake and target creature and opponent controls. If you do, you get 4 energy, which is not an insane amount of energy, and then you sacrifice that creature unless you pay an amount of energy equal to its mana value. So you can steal up to a 4-drop pretty effectively, potentially a bigger card if you have a lot of energy. So you can steal one of their big Eldrazi nonsense creatures. So it's a card where you get your opponent's creature, but they kill you with a bird. And it's a pretty nasty bird. It's a fairly good on rate as a 3/2. There are 2 reasons why I put this card much, much higher than that counterspell that gives your opponent a bird. The first one is that if you play Volatile Storm Drake, you can kill the creature that you are exchanging control of with to fizzle the effect. That means that this can be a card that you play alongside a red burn spell or a black hard removal spell to get a flyer for a really, really good rate, and also not have to do any of the other dumb stuff that this thing does. So that's actually reason 1. Reason 2 is that you can potentially steal something that is so important to the game that it is going to be absolutely incredible to steal. If you have like a couple of energy, you can steal a 6 or 7 drop. That might be an Eldrazi that is just going to absolutely rock the game, and them having a 3/2 is not going to be quite as bad in that circumstance, especially if you're ahead on life or playing a decent control matchup. The third reason that I would call this a okay card is because it is unbelievably good on the play on turn 2. If you play this card on turn 2, it's a 3/2 with flying hexproof from activated and triggered abilities, and your opponent will probably not have a creature at this point. So the ability does not go off, and you just get a flyer that is incredibly good on rate. That flyer is pretty likely to be able to do some good stuff on its own to win the game. So that means that you have a state in the game that is early, where this card is incredible. You have a potential state in the game that is late, where this card is incredible. And then you have a state in the game in the middle, where you can play this card, get a flyer, and still like cast a removal spell and just do a thing that you were going to do anyways, and get some, not value, but some tempo out of it. Those 3 states all exist, and they are all at different points in the game where you're pretty happy to play a Volatile Storm Drake. That is not always going to make up for the states in the game where you play this card and then your opponent gets a flyer and kills you. But all three of those states are so strong, I think, on general rate and value, and so capable of like twisting and just the general flexibility of this card. I think this card is way stronger than it looks. This is gonna be automatic F for so many people, and that's the other thing that I kind of like about it, is that I think this is something where if you are careful with it, if you know what you're doing, and if you are playing the card correctly, then it's super solid for the deck. And that's where I stand on blue. Um, it's quite possible I'm wrong on Volatile Storm Drake, but I think it's one of the most interesting cards in the set in terms of draft evaluations, and how people evaluate this card is gonna, and when people pick it is gonna be pretty important for like understanding the draft format in general. This is a weird fiddly format, and weird fiddly cards like this are sometimes gonna do much better. There are probably quite a few D's and F's and stuff that I really liked that maybe aren't going to be that good. I think this card is one of the ones that's D's and F's for everybody else, that it's actually going to be okay. Everything about how we determine drafting cards is a little bit off here, but I think this is something where, yeah, this is something that actually has like a bit of strength. So that's my blue format review. What a note to end on. Pretty happy with that. We'll be back with another one very shortly. The plan is to release these every 12 hours until we have all of them out, and hopefully that will be before the 11th. So I'm going to take a break and possibly an entire sleep, and then we will be back with the next color, which is, I'm just continuing the down scroll, we're going to go for black. All right, see you next time. Bye.